Welcome to you all, and thanks for coming to today's session, Ambitions for Reducing Emissions. A quick word on the format of what we're going to do this afternoon. We're going to have a very distinguished panel. People always say that, but in this case it really is, and it's a super collection of people who are going to speak each for about 10 minutes. At the end of that, we're then going to have time where we will have questions, answers, comments, discussion, and I hope that you'll have your questions ready, because there's a lot to get through in terms of the topic here. I'll be moderating the session. I'm Gabrielle Walker. I'm a chief scientist of a strategic organisation called Zinteo. We work with big multinationals across more or less all sectors of business, and the idea is that we're trying to reinvent the way we do business. And the climate crisis is an important part of that story. We hold that our way of doing business, our way of growing, is broken along three different axes. The axis of humans versus the environment that sustains us, the nature, the axis of the short term versus the long term, and the axis of the few versus the many. And I think climate change applies to all of those three in almost equal measure. It's about inequality, and it's about short-term thinking almost as much as it's about exceeding our use of resources. Now, behavioural change is fundamental to addressing all of those issues, and it's something that we do a lot on. And I've long believed that this is a hugely neglected area. We've thrown physical science at this problem, we've thrown biological science, we've thrown economic science, we've thrown modelling and computing at it, we've thrown technology and some aspects of innovation. But it seems as though the social science of behavioural change has been trailing in the wake. But it's also quite daunting to think about how to apply behavioural science to this whole area. Thinking on the longer term, which humans have never been designed to do. We just about can manage seasons, but we weren't invented to do that. Sacrifice your privilege for the sake of the greater good. Give up your lifestyle. Give up your pleasures and your happiness. If you look at it that way, then trying to find ways to get people to change their behaviour seems very unlikely. You could say that humans are fundamentally selfish, and I've heard a lot of people say this to me. Humans are not designed to think in decades. Humans crave status and privilege and focus on what's immediately around them rather than the bigger picture. And the one thing that I've learned over the years is if your plan is to fight human nature, you will lose. But humans do have other traits as well that are very fundamental, just as fundamental, if you ask me. The urge to belong, to be part of something, to connect, to crave a sense of purpose, to be a hero, or even just to make a difference, and to be making a difference with other people around you. And even the sensation of status and privilege can be triggered by a lot more than just what you've just bought or what kind of car you drive. So I think there's a lot of rich room for activity in this area, and I'm hoping we're going to cover some of that today. A few things I have learned, though. It doesn't work behaviourally to scare people. You know, I started off in this game. I got very frightened about the whole area of climate change, coming from an academic perspective and then working in the media. And I realised that this was something that frightened me, and I was trying to tell people the way it really is. And it is frightening. But I've learned that just giving people information, including me, doesn't actually have an effect on their behaviour. If I bury my head, then I know that other people are likely to bury theirs. And also the threat seems very distant. I'm sure that, like me, you've been seeing these images of that child on the beach in Turkey. And that's one of the ways that something like this can come very viscerally home to you. This is real, this is what's happening, but it's very rare to have that sensation. And then when you do, you can also think intellectually, and I've had military generals say this to me, huge crisis in migrations coming because of the crisis in climate. There's a direct correlation. But then, as maybe you did too, I can feel very powerless. What can I do? What effect can I have on this? And then there's a question about changing social norms. What if instead of it being a kind of, I feel very hopeless and so I'll just move on, if it can be something more like, this is what we do. And this is what we used to do, and this is what we now do. And I'm hoping we can talk a little bit more about this. Nick and I were talking earlier about the change in drink driving or smoking. People say you can't change people's behaviour, and I say, sure you can. We've done it a lot. And actually giving people the chance to experience a collective social purpose as well can be very powerful. So the question is, can we use behavioural insights to solve the problem of climate change by going with the grain of human nature? And or do we need to rely on technology, political intervention, more invisible changes to the environment so we don't have any choice in the matter, we just have to do it? I'm not sure we'll have a chance to entirely answer that question today, but I'm sure we'll address it a little bit. And I hope we will explore the general role that behavioural insights might play, and also this important question of how do you choose? How do you know when a behavioural intervention is actually likely to be effective? And how do you know when it's not? And a fundamentally different approach would be better. So that's the framing. That's what we're here to do. And our first speaker is Professor Lord Nicholas Stern. He's I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government at the London School of Economics. He's also chairman of the fabulous Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. He did not ask me to say fabulous. That's my own opinion. He's president of the British Academy, fellow of the Royal Society. He is a cross-bench lord in the House of Lords. He is not, he assures me, one of the politicos who've been devaluing the currency lately. He's held previous posts at many other universities in the UK and abroad. He's been chief economist of the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And he was, of course, head of the UK government's economic service and produced the landmark Stern Review, which made such a difference in how we think about the economics of climate change. His most recent book, which I have, and I urge you to rush out and buy, is Why Are We Waiting? The Logic, Urgency and Promise of Tackling Climate Change. Nick, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Gabrielle. And let me begin by making sure this works. So, there are only 4 of them anyway. I don't know why I was fussing so much about the slide. I was asked to talk about the ambitions for reducing emissions. It's got a nice sort of flow to the ambitions to reduce, like a football chant. But the what I wanted to do in the context of Paris and the big meeting coming up in end of November, December this year, which is a major attempt at coming to a global agreement on climate change. So I wanted to frame what I have to say around what's likely to happen in Paris. And we can see reasonably clearly what's likely to happen in Paris. But I wanted to begin by asking where we are in the whole argument about how we handle climate change, particularly relative to where we have been in that discussion. Paris is COP21. 21. I've been to 10. This will be my 10th, and I know people have been to 21. And so you have to ask yourself, well, you know, what are we going to achieve here that we haven't achieved before? Well, partly it's because 3 years ago, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change resolved to try to come to an agreement in Paris. So the target has been set in the same way as it was set for COP15 in Copenhagen 6 years ago. So here's where I'll begin, or how I'll frame an assessment of where we are, is how do we understand things differently from Copenhagen 6 years ago? For me, I think there are 3 major ways in which I now see things differently, and I hope quite a lot of others do as well. The first one is that we now understand that we can put better growth and better climate together. That by moving towards the low-carbon economy, by looking at the innovations technologically, looking at the way in which we can change how we behave, how societies function, how cities function, and so on, we can have better growth and better climate. And that was the title of the report from a commission on the new climate economy, which Felipe Calderon and I chaired, which was published September, just a year ago. So this is a story of combining better growth and getting with climate responsibility and getting both better growth and better climate. You have to do a lot of things to do that. This isn't some win-win that drops into your lap. It requires strong, clear policies, quite major investments and radical changes and so on. But this is not a horse race anymore between growth on the one hand and climate responsibility on the other. That's fundamental, because if it turns into a horse race between growth on the one hand and climate responsibility on the other, you can put your money on the growth horse to win that particular race. But we've understood, and that is a very important change. The second is that the urgency is even stronger than we thought. We all know about the ratchet effect, the flow stock process, where the flows of emissions go up into the stocks, and of course it's very difficult to get the CO2 out, so the later you leave it, the higher the levels of the concentrations and the more difficult it is. But the dangers of the lock-in of high carbon capital, which we also have been stressing for some time, I think we now see as much more severe than we did 6 years ago. Why? Because I think we've seen the structural change in the world economy come through ever more strongly. And we are going to have, we're 50% of 7 billion in cities now, 3.5 billion. We're going to be 70% of 9+ billion in cities in the middle of this century, 6.5 billion. You change only once from 3.5 billion to 6.5 billion in human history. And that is in the next 35 years, and the investment will be largely driven by the next 20 years. This is incredibly urgent. If we lock in polluting, wasteful, emitting infrastructure now, particularly around our cities, but also, of course, our energy systems, we will close off, essentially, the option of 2 degrees. We'll be locked into something that's extremely dangerous. The third thing I think we now see much more clearly is the enormous effect of pollution. Burning hydrocarbons kills people now. It kills people now on a massive scale. The Berkeley Earth publication last month in August, on the back of data now which the Chinese have put together much more carefully with on-ground measurement, not just from satellites, although the satellite measurement is pretty strong too. Living in the east coast of China is like smoking 40 cigarettes a day, child, woman, and man. And the children never recover. If you give up smoking after 3-4 years, you're probably sort of okay, but not if you're breathing that in all the time as a child. This is enormous. India, where I've lived and worked much of my life, is far worse than China. 13 of the 25 most polluted cities in India, far worse. And in the UK, we kill, according to the Supreme Court, accepted this about 4 or 5 months ago, we killed around 29,000 or so. I mean, who knows precisely? Let's call it 30,000 a year from air pollution. 15 times more than road accidents in the UK. Now, if road accidents went up by a factor of 2, everybody would go berserk, and rightly so. 15 times, and that's in the UK. And mostly, of course, from burning hydrocarbons. So that is changing the debate worldwide. It's very important in changing the debate in China. China moved from laggard to leader in all this in terms of ambitions for change. Only beginning in India, but it should have a profound effect here also. We think our air is clean. It's certainly not relative to the damage it's doing. So these 3 things, it seems to me, have all become much clearer and stronger over the last 6 years. This is a different framework for that debate. So let me quickly say something about Paris. The most important thing to begin with, not to end with, the most important thing to begin with in Paris is, where do these so-called intended nationally determined contributions go? Incredibly political language. Intended, not promised, intended. Nationally determined. You lot aren't going to tell us what to do. We tell you what we're going to do. And contributions out of the goodness of our heart. We're sort of it's about as political language as you can get. So better to use INDCs, not to dwell on the words themselves. But they're going to come in. We're about 50 now, 50-ish, a billion ton CO2 equivalent per annum as a world. And they're going to come in about 55, 60 for 2030. We should really be 40 or below for anything like a 2-degree path. All this is stochastic, of course. I mean, say 2 degrees with 50-50 we should be 40 or below. We are probably substantially below some notion of business as usual, but way above where we would need to be. You have to begin there in trying to look at, I think I've been leaning on somebody else's slideshow here, but it doesn't come up. The people who follow me are going to have a problem. So you have to start from there. That 55 plus is not going to change dramatically between now and December. So the question is, what does it mean? Well, it means that Paris can only be a beginning. That in Paris, indeed the test of success in Paris is not whether it's 55, 56 or 57. It'll be one of those things. The test in Paris is whether we agree to methods for ramping up ambition. And that's the key part of the story. Indeed, we also have to recognize that if we're way above where we should be for the next 20 years, we are going to have to be very low at the rest of this century. And we have to go zero net carbon, essentially, by the end of the century, because we're so high now for the next 20 years. So you've got to think about how you can do that. Well, perhaps in the discussion we can talk about that. So the structure of the agreement, then I've already indicated the INDCs. You're going to have that long-term shared goal of net zero or negative by the end of the century. That will be contentious. The G7 have already announced this year in Germany decarbonisation of the world economy in the second half of the century. That kind of language is there in some places internationally. Will it get into Paris? That I don't yet know, and I'm not sure how to predict. But what we've got then in Paris is 4 elements of the Paris Alliance for Climate Action. The agreement itself around the formal relationships for revision and so on, the INDCs, the finance and technology. That will be, if you excuse the language, around coalitions of the willing rather than formally written in to the agreement itself. And then what they call the agenda for action. There should be a comma after technology on that slide, I noticed. The agenda for action, which is sort of informal coalitions. So where, and this is my last slide, where does all that leave us? Well, this next 2 decades, come back to where I began, are absolutely fundamental. This isn't something that we should be meandering along towards, doing a bit here, a bit there, getting better, that's good. All that is good. But the urgency, that sense of urgency is fundamental. If we don't take this opportunity, we'll lose it. And that, for me, is the most important thing to have as a shared understanding in Paris. How we get to that shared understanding, perhaps we can look at in discussion. Examples are very important. Discussion, moral leadership. I never thought I'd be a fan of a pope. I now am a fan, not of a pope, the pope, and we're going to see him next week. But above all, it's this coming together of growth, sustainable growth on the one hand, and climate responsibility on the other. There are 2 defining challenges this century: overcoming poverty and managing climate change. If we fail on one, we fail on the other, but we've got a tremendous chance of succeeding on both, and that's why this is so important. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Charlie Wilson, lecturer at the University of East Anglia. He's at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia and is a researcher in the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. He looks especially at the intersection between innovation and behaviour and policy in the general field of energy and climate change. And really, we were talking about this the other day, he's interested at both a systems level and also at a micro level, and I think those 2 levels are going to be quite important to us. Previously, he too was at the London School of Economics. He has a PhD from the University of British Columbia in Canada, and he's worked for quite a lot of years in the private sector in both renewable energy finance and climate change policy. So I hope he's going to give us another set of context, but this time specifically into the area of behavioural change. Charlie, over to you.
Great, many thanks. I'm also looking at weird slides. I'm hoping, oh yeah, brilliant, okay. So I'm going to hopefully provide a sort of bridge between what Lord Stern was describing in terms of context and what the next 2 speakers will describe in terms of very real and practical applications of behavioural insights. I'm going to offer some examples of behavioural insights in this space and also kind of reflect a little bit on their possible limits. So these kinds of graphs are very common in our field. You see a whole range of possible futures, which they're irreducibly uncertain, but you see a lone blue line trending downwards, which is the path we need to get emissions onto if we're to stay within, consistent with a 2 degrees C world. Now, one of the sort of predominant approach, certainly in the near term, that we need is to dramatically improve the efficiency with which we use energy and to reduce energy demand, particularly in developed countries. That's in addition to removing carbon from the energy supply. So the International Energy Agency cites energy efficiency as the priority in the near term, and there are many, many scenario studies looking longer term that show energy efficiency technologies diffused pervasively throughout our economy. If you take the example of sort of very advanced high efficiency homes, those equivalent with the German passive house standards, currently these are about less than 0.1% of all existing homes in developed countries. These need to be over 75%. Almost all homes need to be retrofitted up to these kinds of standards by 2050. So behavioural insights can certainly contribute to these efforts. This was a study from the US, which looked at a range of personal actions people could take at home and also on the road when driving. The researchers looked at the kinds of contributions to emission reductions that these measures could take. And you see that the top one there is energy efficient retrofits, all the way down to more kind of behavioural things like changing the set point of your thermostat and so forth. And there are many, many really interesting studies showing that behavioural insights can contribute to this. This was, by now, a very famous study from 2008 in which researchers showed that exposing households to descriptive social norms about what other people are doing with energy can influence their own private energy use. And this is now sort of encapsulated within the business model that O-Power have successfully scaled up to very large numbers of homes. This was a very recent study showing that if you change the default when you're choosing your electricity tariff, rather than the default being a sort of typical brown power tariff and you can opt in to a green power tariff, if you set the default as a green power tariff, you have very, very high rates of take-up. In other words, people don't choose to opt out. We've seen lots of examples of this at this conference. And here's a way of increasing the visual salience of energy loss. This yellow strip under a door in this thermal image of a home is a way of making visible what really is invisible in terms of the energy that we leak from our homes on a huge basis, particularly during the winters. So lots of really interesting, where am I supposed to point this? Oh, there we go. Lots of really interesting applications of behavioural insights. And colleagues of mine in the Tyndall Centre have also looked at the way in which behavioural science can inform engaging publics with climate change. So research showing that framing climate change in the gain frame rather than the loss frame, framing climate change in terms of local proximate impacts rather than distant impacts, helps people understand the severity of the problem. Research showing that kind of iconic imagery like polar bears on ice floes, which you've probably seen time and time again in climate-related social marketing, can help to increase the perceived importance of the problem, but interestingly can undermine the people's sense of self-efficacy in what they can actually do to address that problem. And then more recently, there's kind of increasing amounts of work looking at whether people exposed to extreme climate events are more likely to take action in order to mitigate climate change or do something about it. So there's lots of really interesting behavioural work in this field. And the way that this makes its way into policy is generally following Richard Thaler's nudge mantra number 1 that we heard yesterday. Make it easy for people to change by removing barriers to that behaviour. If you look at, say, the energy efficiency strategy in the UK, it's full of these barriers being identified and policies designed to remove those barriers. So think about energy efficient homes. Remember this sort of goal, if you like, to be consistent with 2 degrees C, 75% of all homes retrofitted to the most advanced standards by 2050. Barriers that prevent people from doing this, there are endless reports and studies listing these kinds of barriers. We're not aware of the possibilities. Energy use doesn't have the salience in our domestic life. We lack liquidity. We have very high implicit discount rates when making decisions about investments. We're uncertain about future savings, and so on and so on. So in the UK, the Green Deal was a policy launched in 2013 that you can see as a policy which I think was quite carefully designed in response to these identified barriers. So energy assessments would address the problem of awareness and salience. Loan financing would address the problems of liquidity. A minimum level of savings, which would always be greater than what you had to repay each month, was a way of addressing uncertainties, and so on and so on. There's many more details of this particular policy. It hasn't worked. It hasn't really worked. The green bars show the number of assessments which were going on each month. This is energy experts coming to people's homes to evaluate their homes and recommend cost-effective energy savings. And the red columns, which you'd be forgiven for not seeing at the back, are the numbers of those assessments that have turned into loan financings to renovate. It should be said that there are possibly many people who get the assessments and then renovate using their own money, and actually I'm one of them. But nevertheless, the policy as a whole has underperformed in terms of expectations. So that's the period of the Green Deal on the left. To put it in a historical context, on the right, it's the very flat bit on the right-hand side of the graph. And these dotted lines are showing insulation measures going into UK homes. So there's been an enormous drop-off in those levels of insulation as the Green Deal was introduced. And bear in mind, this is in the context of an incredible urgency around bringing homes up. Here we're talking to a minimal level of efficiency in order to stay on track with, in this case, UK climate commitments. So my own research offers kind of one explanation as to what's going on here, and that is possibly what you might think is a blindingly obvious statement, that when you're deciding to renovate your home, you're not deciding about energy, you're deciding about your home. If you look at home renovations in the UK, well over half have nothing to do with energy. They're to do with what we think of as the amenity features of your home, your kitchen, your living room, your bathroom, your lofts, your garages, and so forth. And only about 1 in 10 renovations really are discretely energy related. It's that small market segment, the green at the top, which the Green Deal was designed, and many kind of energy efficiency policies are designed to try and target. The second kind of fairly obvious thing is if you ask people what their home means to them, you get a whole bunch of words like represented in this cloud. Each word is sized relative to the frequency with which it comes up. And you'd have to have really, really good eyesight, even at the front, to spot words relating to energy or even money. And yet the Green Deal is a policy, and many, many energy efficiency policies try and change this particular behavior relating to energy. So if you look at the little bubble at the bottom, the change or the delta in behavior, what's actually happening is that this behavior is nested within all sorts of other really interesting stuff around meaning and identity and values and culture and practices. Now, if you think about that in relation to behavioural insights, you put it into kind of behavioural insights type language, I would argue that much energy-related behaviour is not particularly plastic. Now, the study I showed you before with the green bars from the US, I've superimposed these red bars, which show what of those potential savings are realistically achievable. Now, the way that they calculated what was realistically achievable was by looking at the best possible evidence from field trials, from experiments, from policies, and from programs, looking at the percentage of non-adopters, so people who didn't do a particular behavior or use a particular technology, and then those who had changed to do that behavior or use that technology as a result of this trial or program. And then they used that as a measure of this plasticity, and then they scaled down the potential from technically potential to realistically achievable. Now, this kind of idea of limited plasticity of energy-related behaviour is also lots of evidence in the UK. This was a review for DEC I was involved with a couple of years ago. It's very uncommon you find even the best designed behavioural trials that produce more than, say, 5 to 10% reductions in energy use. In other words, behaviour change is marginal. And in the words of David Mackay, the former chief scientific advisor to DEC, climate change is a big problem. We need big differences in behaviour, and little changes do not add up to those big differences. So just to sort of conclude, I hope I've given you some examples of some behavioural insights and how they can apply to climate change, but I don't think climate change is narrowly a behavioural problem. So the graph I've shown you before on the left, I put the accident emergency ward there not as a kind of striking visual metaphor of where I think we're headed, but to illustrate the fact that hospitals are very good at triage. They're very good at understanding when particular problems arrive, what is an appropriate way of dealing with them. I think behavioural insights certainly can be one, but I think climate change is a systemic problem. What Lord Stern describes as this kind of deep structural transformation that we need in this coming century has an awful lot of other stuff that we can and should be doing. And I haven't listed on the right the sort of old classics of regulation, standards, prices, taxes, and so forth. So there's a lot of things I think we can be doing with respect to climate change. Applying behavioural insights is certainly one of them, but it's only a part of the story.
Thanks very much, David. So having convinced you all that, that behavioural insights are not applicable to this, we will now try and change your mind again, I guess, which is with our next speaker, Simon Hill. And Charlie already referred to some of the work that Simon's going to tell us about at OPower. So Simon's OPower's VP for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. And this is actually amazing. I started writing about and talking about OPower some sort of 7 years ago. And now they're working with more than 90 utility partners, more than 50 million customers around the world. And it's all about consumer engagement solutions. So Simon leads OPower's external engagement operations across the region, all about energy efficiency. And he's a graduate of the University of Durham and Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. He served in the British Army in combat operations, so don't mess with him. And he's also worked as an advisor to the British Conservative Party. But he has a lot of experience in business development, strategy, regulation, communications. And he's here to tell us about an example of how behavioural influences can change behaviour when it comes to energy efficiency.
Gabrielle, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present. Just ignore the army stuff. I'm really approachable, I promise. I'm going to take umbrage, actually, with what Charlie has said about the behavioural piece. And I don't have this in the slide, but it's a really good point. Fundamentally, energy and energy usage, which relates to energy efficiency, is really boring. It's a really boring subject. And that's fundamentally why things like Green Deal and other policies didn't work, because it's boring. It's really boring. So in order to do it, and to do it well, you have to get people's attention. And that's very hard, particularly when you're competing with things like Facebook, television, Netflix, you name it. Before I start, how many people in the room have heard of OPower? Put up your hand if you have. Okay, so you're talking to a relatively educated audience. Great. Okay, super. So most of you will be familiar with the OPower story, how we got going, how we use normative benchmark comparisons to deliver highly personalized insights, behavioral insights to people, in order to engage them on what is ostensibly an incredibly dull subject. And that's why we believe that behavioral energy efficiency needs to be at the cornerstone of all energy efficiency policy, because things like retrofitting your house or all other factors around energy efficiency, if consumers, if people, if citizens are not engaged, fundamentally you're going to fail. The piece I want to talk about today is actually a little bit different to what is perhaps what traditionally has been OPower's core business, and we've successfully, from a commercial standpoint, made a viable business and a very successful business out of delivering behavioral energy efficiency. But actually what I want to talk today about is behavioral demand response. Because actually, when you talk about the likes of China and India and the problems of pollution in those countries, actually a lot of the problem is not just about the mechanism by which we generate energy across the course of the year, but actually the dirtiest form of energy is typically at a point in time when demand is high. And what a lot of energy companies and energy producers do when demand is high is they effectively stick on what is enormous diesel engines to meet demand on a grid when the demand is high. And of course, that disproportionately impacts the amount of emissions as a result. So if we can reduce demand at particular key points in time, not only reducing energy across the piece, actually that's a fundamentally important thing in terms of tackling climate change. And smart grids is fundamentally important to delivering demand response. It's also big infrastructure projects. The UK alone is spending 11 billion sterling on smart grids over the next 5 years. So what are we wanting to do? Well, we've invested a lot of money in our normative benchmark comparison, our home energy reports, which you can see there in various different forms, whether it be on a smartphone, an iPad, a computer, web, paper reports. But fundamentally, that 3-bar chart, that 3-bar comparison that you can see is one of those key drivers that makes what is ostensibly this very boring subject actually a little bit more interesting. Where is OPower? Well, OPower started back in 2007 with two great guys, Dan and Alex, and it's grown now to be a billion-dollar company. We IPO'd last year, and we now have offices in London, Singapore, Tokyo. Our engineering hub is in San Francisco, and our global headquarters are in Washington, D.C. That slide is, I apologize, slightly out of date. We're now working with many more utilities in many more parts of the world. But the story I want to talk about today is this piece around demand response, and indeed around a particular utility on the eastern seaboard of the United States, BG&E, or Baltimore Gas and Electric. Now, we talked before about how energy at peak points on the grid is actually not just very expensive. In effect, you can think about it like a wholesale market, a stock exchange, high-priced products, but also very dirty. The outlier on that is Scandinavia, where typically they use a huge amount of hydro to meet demand at key points when demand is high. But outside of Scandinavia and certain parts of Canada, actually around the rest of the world particularly, it's very dirty when it's peak. So actually, how do we shave that peak? How do we reduce emissions? Well, with any commercial company, there's going to be a business case. And indeed, the business case here for Baltimore Gas and Electric wasn't just around energy efficiency or operational savings or avoided costs, but they also wanted to bring in dynamic pricing. And by what we mean, time of use tariffs. But that's interesting because that's also a behavioral thing. Customers don't like dynamic pricing. Customers don't like that risk, that variation in a pricing structure. And so typically if you bring in dynamic pricing, time of use tariffs, to consumers at particular points of the day, they're going to say, no, thank you very much, I don't want it. And you get all kinds of behavioral problems with getting engagement with consumers as a result. So can you find another way to bring it in that is actually acceptable, and can you use behavioral science to do that? Another challenge you have is a lot of the United States is now moving towards smart meters. Europe is following suit. Great swathes of the Middle East and Asia Pacific are also doing the same. But in a sense, that brings a further challenge in that you have an enormous amount of data to manage. And how do you bring these challenges around behavioral science, about computer science, and about data science analytics? How do you bring it all together to make it work? And historically, just to think about, that's something in the region of 3,000x in terms of jump in data that you're going to have to process. And that's a huge amount. How many people here send 1 or 2 meter readings to their energy company? Hands up. Yeah, probably a few. How many think about 4 or 6? Yeah, okay. So you get an idea of the scale of the amount of data coming in. It's a big change. But ostensibly, when people have tried, behavioral demand response is not new. Over the last 10 years, there have been over 100 pilots of people trying to get people, residential consumers of energy, to drive demand response, behavioral demand response, in the last 10 years. And pretty much all of them have failed. And I think you could probably characterize why in 3 pieces. Because when they try it as a pilot and it's really small, it works really well, great. But when you try and scale it up, it becomes a challenge. Energy companies typically also hide the benefits. So if you're bringing in dynamic pricing, actually, if you're giving money back to people for having used less at peak points, which is if you think about it, just another way of bringing in dynamic pricing, a clever way, they hide it. They don't talk about it. They don't get people's attention. And thirdly, that leads to the real key issue, which is it's really hard to get people's attention. What is, and I'm going to say it again, behavioral reinforcement. What is ostensibly a really boring subject, it's really hard. So you've got to hammer it home. So what do you need to do? Well, you need technology on a vast scale, a powerful technological platform. But you need other things as well. You need rich data. It has to be multi-channel. You have to segment your markets to the form of the channel that best meets your consumers. But fundamentally, you also have to have behavioral science in there to drive it forward. So what did we do? So we used a range of things from online reinforcement to multi-channel approach. But essentially what BG&E said to us was, look, If we're going to have a peak day, a day where we want people to use less because we expect demand to be high, if we let you know at 5 p.m. the day before, can you talk to all of our customers and get them to use a little bit less on a peak day? And we said, well, we're not absolutely sure, but I tell you what, let's give it a go. And that's what we did. So we got a note from BG&E at 5 p.m. the day before. And from that moment, we would then start contacting their customers through a range of pre-event notifications, whether it be through email, SMS, or telephone. On the peak day itself, people would start to use less, we believed. And then at the end, and this is crucial, you'd give them a post-event summary of how much they used, again using that normative benchmark comparison. You used X, your neighbors used Y. Next time, think about how much you can use. But did it work? Well, what I want to show you now is a very short 1-minute video, which is showing you typically how it's hard to get that engagement, how it's hard to make what is ostensibly a very boring subject interesting. And just to show you how this is, the yellow you here is you're seeing is people engaged through devices they already have in their homes of how much engagement you're getting. This is the greater Baltimore area you're seeing now, which is across the eastern seaboard of the US. Then you're saying, okay, what if OPOW come in? Or you're seeing a dramatic increase in the amount of engagement through multi-channel approach, reaching lots of different people. And just zoom out a little bit there, you'll see it. That's us then going, reaching out through different channels. The mediums are up there on the right, hard to see, I know, across before the peak event. And then you're going to show you a heat map of, well, how much energy did they save on the peak day? And again, the red is obviously huge amounts of energy they're saving. And again, irrespective of demographics, you're seeing a huge amount of energy saved. And then as it comes towards the end, crucially, post-event communication, again through segmentation of the markets, different channels, going back to people. This is crucial. How much did you actually save relative to your neighbors? The next time you have a peak event, can you have more? So did it work? There we go. The answer is yes. And actually, you delivered something in the region of a 5% reduction. I think originally when we ran this through with BG&E, when we talk about pilots, we were talking something in the region of 800,000 households. We're now into the millions of households. So when we're talking about doing it at scale, we're doing it on a scale in a very large way. But ultimately also customers like it. On what is, I'll say it again, an ostensibly very boring subject, actually this is getting customers to tweet, to put onto their Instagrams and talk about it. So to bring us back to climate change and its emissions, and these are the European targets, the current ones, the 2020 reductions, if we're going to even meet those, fundamentally, and I'm going to disagree with Charlie here, we need to change our stance. Because ultimately, it's about that engaged consumer and having behavioral science as a hallmark. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And so we do have an opportunity now for some questions, comments, discussion, and maybe even a bit of a punch-up, as I said. So what I would say is please make your questions brief, question, not a peroration, and also say who you are. And I'll pass this around among you for answering. Okay, gentleman at the back first.
My name is Robin White. I'm from a company called Engine, which is a communication group. I'm really interested that none of you talked about status. The last presentation delivered status of various product, but for me, I see a major barrier is that there's no status in good climate change behavior. You don't know my energy bill, I don't know yours. And it seems to me until we make status signaling behavior, in this last room we had Peacock's tail talk about that, don't think we're going to make all the progress we need to make.
Okay, great, thanks for excellent comment about status. And then lady here. Just making you run around, Toby.
Thanks. We've heard 3 excellent solutions which were nudge related. So my question is to Nicholas Stern. Why don't we do more what Dan said about doing the very big push rather than the little nudges? I've done some work with the EEA, and it's all about just a big talking shop, reasons why things can't be done, political issues, going to lose votes, And we're just going to be where we are in 20 years' time unless some of those really big pushes are made. So I think that's the plea to Paris. Be brave.
Okay, so status, big push, and then the gentleman here.
So far, all the discussions were about consumers. And I was wondering, given that energy use is mostly at the industry level, why don't we focus on industry? My name is Thomas Dirk, I'm from the Ministry of Economic Affairs in the Netherlands.
Okay, great. That's 3 good questions. So who wants to start with status?
Maybe I'll kick off with status. So status is really one of the key points we talk about, because in OPOW's home energy reports and on the 3-bar chart, that normative benchmark comparison is showing what your usage is, how that relates to your usage with your average neighbours, and then with your most energy efficient neighbours. And it
display your own usage.
It does.
In public to other people.
Okay, I see where you're going. For in public, yeah, naming and shaming in public. Or encouraging. I think there are pros and cons of that, but the work and the trials we've done shows that actually you do deliver quite significant amounts of energy efficiency through that nudge that you're getting the home energy reports in your home. Let me also just deal with the other 2 points very briefly, actually, because they're really good points. The one on big pushes. So this is where I fundamentally perhaps disagree. I think behavioural energy efficiency needs to be the cornerstone of energy efficiency, because if you haven't got people engaged in energy efficiency, then forget all the big stuff, because it doesn't actually matter, because people aren't engaged until you get them engaged.
Sorry, hang on. Let's just hear.
You don't even need to legislate. You don't have to legislate. It rather depends on how you design policy. Legislation is one key point, absolutely, but there are many others. And then the third point you mentioned about CNI, the industry, it's a good point, and we do work with industry. But actually, industry is often quite sensible, because when you're thinking about energy efficiency and how you retrofit buildings, businesses, because they're thinking about the bottom line, actually will appoint a building manager, someone who actually wants to regulate the thermostat, the temperature, things like that. Actually, it is industry use a lot of energy, but in terms of energy management, they're actually pretty good. It's residential homes, it's customers, it's people that are hard, and that's why behavioural science is critical.
Okay, thanks. Charlie, I just wondered if I could ask you, on this question of what role behavioural insights can actually play. There is that point that engaging people in doing something can actually also enable them to feel more involved and connected, and also put more pressure on the other people, both the industry and the political players, who then might be able to do the bigger push. What do you think about that?
Yes, I agree, and I don't want to. I know it's much more exciting having a punch-up, but to be a bit more conciliatory, I don't actually think what I was saying is inconsistent with what these guys were saying at all. The evidence that you both showed with your respective kind of behavioural and technological solutions was in that kind of 5 to 10% energy demand reduction range that I was talking about from the best available evidence that we have. But if you put that in the context of this bigger systemic challenge, it's an important step, but it cannot be the only step. I agree, upstream, supply chain, market transformation, work in industry, obviously huge amounts of innovation in terms of the energy supply and how we use energy resources. And yes, I completely agree, regulation. This is a slightly probably indirect answer to your question, but I think one of the risks of thinking of climate change as a behavioural insights problem is that it downplays or possibly sidelines the importance of sort of, perhaps older-fashioned approaches. I talked about the Green Deal. There was one interesting regulatory dimension to the Green Deal, which was that I think originally by 2016, all homeowners spending X amount of money, I think £10,000 or more, on kitchens, bathrooms, living rooms, etc., would be obliged at the same time to bring their home up to a minimum standard of energy efficiency. And they could use Green Deal finance to essentially make that no upfront cost. But that regulatory measure was scrapped in Parliament. And so, this sort of emphasis on behaviour change as the main or the sole approach, I think risks sidelining other very effective strategies.
Thanks, Charlie. Nick?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about how you get big changes. And look at it in 2 ways. I do think regulation is a very big part of the story. The way in which our lighting has changed in the last 5 years or so is quite remarkable. And a lot of that has been regulation. And then regulation drove the innovation, and we've ended up with LEDs, which are just amazing relative to what we might have imagined. And there you're getting your factors of 15 or 20 or more in that particular area. It's one area, but it's a very important one. And regulation did that. If you think of leaded and unleaded petrol, regulation did that. If you think of the way in which fuel efficiency has changed in motor vehicles, largely regulation that did that. And it can really drive technological change in a very powerful way. And it's good economics in many ways because it gives clarity, and that kind of clarity enables people to plan for scale and plan for investment. So that is one part of the story. A second part of the story is trying to understand how you get big change in attitudes. I think the way in which people recycle now is a fundamental change in attitude about what is responsible behaviour. And that changes through evidence, making it easier for people to do it, so that if you saw your neighbours, throwing their rubbish into the street, not everywhere, but in many places, that kind of social pressure would be quite effective. If you look at cigarette smoking, that took quite a long time, but the behavioural change came from evidence, public discussion, regulation about where you could smoke, and so on. So I think you have to look at drunk driving. I mean, I'm probably older than anybody in this room, but I was a student in the 60s, and people used to drink and drive totally irresponsibly. My own children, all in their 30s, wouldn't dream of doing what we did. That may be in part because their license would be taken away, but I think it's, for the most part, a more positive thing. It's because it would be irresponsible so to do, and your friends would tell you that this is outrageous. Indeed, they might even stop you. At least I hope they would stop you. So I think partly we look at regulation, and partly we have to understand how the really big changes have come about. Gay marriage, quite extraordinarily fast, how these things happen. So I'm not pessimistic about big change, but I do think there's lots of evidence out there as to how it happens. Regulation, a big part of the story, social pressure, leadership, and so on. And we have to look very closely at those. But there are enough good examples out there that you needn't, I think one needn't despair. You despair about where we are and the pace of change, but not as to whether it's possible.
Thanks very much. And Andy, I'm just thinking if you can pass...
Some of this in the last chapter of my book, which you'll buy after all profits go to the London School of Economics.
So moving on to Andy, I was just thinking that in terms of what Nick was just saying about big, rapid behavioural changes. I mean, I remember the first iPods, and I remember the piles of CDs that I now have in a cupboard somewhere. And you were talking very encouraging, not just with the take of a Nest, but in various examples before of a new technology plus something enticing about it, plus some kind of change in the norm, can actually change things very quickly.
Yeah,
in a
that's
big
right.
way.
And so there are technologies that perhaps don't need to wait for regulation, that can just build off customer sentiment and desire. But I think one of the more stark trends that's happening today is we're able to prototype hardware on 3D printers now. And what took us 16 months to develop the first generation iPad when we were at Apple now only takes 3 months. And so legislation operates at the speed of law. Innovation is operating at the speed of Silicon Valley. And so the question is, do we wait for regulation when it comes to really, all you're really doing is asking customers to save money. You're not asking them to change their gasoline type or retrofit their engine block to accept unleaded fuel. You're asking them just to save money and to go and program a schedule on their thermostat. If they're not willing to do that, then you're asking them to go out and buy a new thermostat or work with their energy provider to get one free of charge. And so I think legislation has an important leveling effect. I think it can provide very important subsidies, particularly for low-income households on efficiency measures. But I think where legislation trips up, it's when it gets into a mode of not just telling you what needs to be done, but telling you how it should be done.
Great.
And if legislation goes into that second category, it will never be able to keep up with the pace of innovation.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, more questions.
It could help drive innovation.
It definitely could, and that's the leveling of the playing field effect. That if legislation is set up to be more of a sandbox for innovation, to prepare the groundwork for tech labs and startups and multinationals to come in and really invest in solar inverters, in battery storage chemistries, in recycling technologies. I mean, this is where that plays a very important role.
And that's, I suppose, the same principle with the low carbon fuel initiative in California. So you use the regulation to set what needs to be done and the standards, and then you allow industry and technology to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing that can change fast is very big price increases. So we need a very substantial price for carbon, and we shouldn't go on. We shouldn't stop going on about that. So the relative price is part driven by innovation, but also part driven by policy. Really do start to change.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is watching what's going on with Tesla in Silicon Valley right now.
Yeah.
Elon Musk is an incredible guy. Very similar traits to the traits I used to experience with, what I used to see at Apple, and particularly with Steve Jobs. And he has that drive, that vision, and that energy to do things that most others wouldn't dare to do. But what's interesting about Tesla is he's captured the spirit of those three design principles in a car that most people really wouldn't normally go out and buy at that price point. And he's able to sustain those sales despite the fact that fuel prices have come right down in recent months. It's had absolutely no effect on his sales. He's still, churning out these cars at an unprecedented rate. But they're wonderful. They're
gorgeous.
Cars. And that is the key. That he's designed a car which is on performance level at the level of a Porsche or a Jaguar or whatever it might be. But he has addressed the core visceral performance, interaction, engagement first, and then the other aspects around the zero emissions and the savings I make by not having to take it in to get serviced every 6 months because there are no moving parts there's no engine block. And all those things, those are just added sweeteners, and that helps his message go viral and people to get really excited about it.
And actually that brings us back to the original comment about status, that what's beautiful about what he's done is he's managed to switch.
Yeah.
So you get the status out of having one of these cars instead of out of having one of those cars, and status can still be a very powerful operator, I think.
In my early design years, I saw so many companies, large companies, develop a sort of a green product line. It was in sort of the 1990s and early 2000s, and they would always do it on their lowest end,
it's very worthy.
lowest quality product, and that it was destined for failure from day one.
Yeah.
And so that's the number one mistake when it comes to status.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, some more questions, please. So the lady here and then the gentleman here.
Thanks. Philippa Ward from Global Action Plan. I was interested in the fact, Nick, your comments on air quality and the increasing impacts of that, and then also, I think it was Andy, on how people react to being engaged around climate change with increased flooding. And I just wondered what you thought about the part that might play with more extreme climate events, without wanting to paint a doom picture, but whether you think that will leave people more open to these kind of conversations.
Great, thanks. Okay, and the gentleman over here.
I'm Knut Kjervold from Green Nudge in Norway. So the day before I came here, I had a meeting with the Energy Producers Corporation, and I said to them, it's a great idea to use the new meters to influence Norwegian consumers' energy consumption. And then they said, we really don't care because all energy in Norway is hydroelectric, so it has no CO2. and the only problem is the one of effect. So at certain times of the day, we use too much. And also hydroelectric power in Norway is quite cheap for consumers. So my question to you is quite practical. I'm going to meet them again on Monday. So what's your suggestion?
The Norwegian energy providers.
What should I say? Should they go on, and should we do a metering experiment with them, or should we just say it's a bad idea? People don't care, and there's no hope in engaging them.
Okay, great. Two great questions. Thanks. Nick, do you want to start?
Yeah, let me try with air pollution. I think it's beginning to change the debate in a fundamental way. I've been working in China now for over 25 years, in India for over 40 years. And the last 5 years in China, air pollution has greatly influenced their strategy. And we started to understand how big the effect was from satellite observation. And there, looking at China, you find out PM 2.5 is right across the East Coast. It's not just in Beijing. Then the medics get, like they did on smoking, get partly epidemiology, partly looking at the direct effects, start to tell us just how big this thing is. People see their children in dire straits with bronchial and other problems. So that starts to build. Very senior Chinese officials, people who write the 5-year plan, who I've worked with over the years, say, well, what's the point of all this apparent increase in prosperity if our cities are unlivable? So it has had a profound effect on changing the politics. It's also true that they're very worried about climate change, particularly because climate change is through water or its absence in some shape or form. And of course, China has been driven by water management for millennia. The main rivers come off the Himalayas, and who knows what's going to happen to the flows of those. So they're very worried about climate change. They also rather fancy winning the green race. Mm. Now, those three arguments are big arguments which won't go away. But I do think that the air pollution story has been fundamental, not the only one, but fundamental in changing the debate in China. I think people are starting to wake up here to air pollution. The numbers are enormous. I mean, 30,000 a year in the UK dying from air pollution. That's not counting the people who are maimed and damaged by the whole thing. If you took a standard value for life that they use in ambulance, road planning, and so on, you're talking about, just in the UK itself, 3 or 4% of GDP. These things are enormous. And if people see that by stopping burning hydrocarbons, they can not only stop killing people now, they can also stop killing people in the future, then it starts to build up. But killing people now is a huge deal. And it's getting people to understand just how big that problem is. When, in the case of PM 2.5, you can't actually see the smog. Now, I grew up in London in the 50s when you couldn't see sometimes more than 2 or 3 yards in front of you, and at the same time, people were dying through bronchitis and lung diseases, quite remarkably. It's very easy to see the connection. So we have to help understand that connection. But the evidence is the last few years, and it's building up very strongly. It's a very bad thing to start understanding, but it's a very good thing if you want to change people's attitudes to burning hydrocarbons. And
making it visceral, making that connection. And then
on saving energy in Norway, well, hydro energy is not free, and if it's easy to, you can work out what it does cost. So why not save it if it's very cheap to save it? And then you can sell more to, I know that you have problematic neighbours, you don't like the Swedes, but I mean you can, there are lots, work for a much better energy grid in Europe. We should be selling solar energy from Spain, where the value of land in central Spain is essentially zero. You should be sending that northwards, doing wind energy where it's windy, hydro where you've got the stuff. And if you had a proper energy market, then it's not just the hydro that you don't use, it's the hydro that you could export to other parts, maybe Poland, for example.
And I'd also add that it gives you the opportunity to have a better relationship with your customers. Nobody's ever going to hate you for saving the money, even if it's a relatively small amount of money. The city of Cape Town, a local government, said that they transformed their relationship with all of their customers by not just getting a reduction in their emissions, but also by connecting to them and saying, we're the people who saved you money. We're almost out of time.
Champion the European grid. We've got cheap stuff we can sell to you if only you build a proper grid.
We're almost out of time. So if any of the three of you want to make a comment on those questions, that'd be great. And then I just want to ask you very quickly something about Paris. So just in a
very quick
few
answer
seconds.
on the flooding question. Yes, there is an increasing body of work that shows that experiencing extreme weather events sensitizes people to be more concerned about climate change. It's not a simple story. In the US, for example, political preference is a mediator and Republicans and Democrats respond differently. But generally, yes. However, I don't think anyone is necessarily suggesting that we use that as a kind of behavioral insight to motivate action on climate change.
Okay, so...
Are you suggesting that we should?
So what I will do now is I'll say we have run out of time. I just want to ask one more question to each of our panellists. I'm going to give you sort of 30 seconds each to answer it, if you're ready for that. Which is, we've talked about behavioural change among individuals, consumers, how we can make big changes, but we are looking towards Paris, as Nick just described. So just in a quick sort of 15, 20 seconds, how optimistic do you feel about what will come out of Paris?
4 out of 10.
4 out of 10. Excellent. Next.
5.5 out of 10.
Okay, go on, Charlie.
I'm optimistic that the global community is still talking about it. I'm not optimistic that they'll reach an agreement consistent with the 2 degrees C target.
Nick?
There will be an agreement. The overall emissions will be way above what's necessary for 2 degrees. So for me, the test of a success in Paris is the mechanisms they put in place for ramping up ambition. Yeah. And that's the key test. If they start a process which could move quickly, where there's mutual confidence, then it would be well worthwhile.
Absolutely, thanks. I wrote down this quote, Paris can only be a beginning, and I think that's maybe something that we need to have in our heads going up to November and beyond. So I will say very quickly, thank you very much to all of our panellists and to all of you. I want to make one last comment about behavioural change, and it's something quite spectacular that some research that I came across in Australia about reducing water use. And it was a brilliant combination of local government. It was the state of Victoria having a massive drought. They had to try and get people to stop using so much water. And what they did was a combination of giving control over your water use with a fantastic marketing campaign. And here's what they did. First of all, they had pictures of what I must say was quite a hunky, dirty plumber. If I can get clean in a shower in 4 minutes, so can you. They had young people, they had two 20-something Australian boys sharing a house going, look how we're saving water. And they took you into the kitchen where they hadn't done the dishes for 2 weeks. They took you into the laundry where there was piles of dirty laundry. And now we're going to go and get into the bath together, and off they did. And what was clever about this is it was funny. It wasn't boring. It was interesting. It was entertaining. Everybody watched it. And in a matter of months, they changed the norms. In a matter of months, there was a massive reduction in water use among consumers. But here's the interesting thing. The industry players who had not been targeted started to reduce their water use. And they asked themselves why, and it turned out that because the social norms from the people, from the consumers, had changed so dramatically, they started putting pressure on. Any time any industry user was perceived as wasting water, they got grief about it, and they changed. So I take that as being a combination of fun, inventiveness, creativity, big, very rapid change across the board. And I take that as something that's really quite, gives me a lot of optimism for the behavioural changes that will come in Paris and the behavioural changes that we hope will come afterwards. So thank you to all of you and to our wonderful panel. Thanks very much.